Now, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to welcome you to our fifth lecture in the series of Understanding Europe's East. Bună seara, domnilor și domnilor! Bine ați venit în Trinity College Dublin. Before I start, just a few housekeeping events. Here, in the unlikely case of an emergency, we have two exits at the back, one from which you came in and the other one from which you could exit. If I may just request everyone to turn off their mobile phones. And lastly, we aim for the lecture to last for around 30 to 40 minutes, and all of the questions will be allowed in the end. My name is Anna Stinka. I am here on behalf of the Eastern European Society. And just a few words about the society in the beginning. I founded it with two of my friends just 2 years ago with the main goal of promoting the cultural heritage of our countries. And so it's my greatest delight to actually see events like this and lectures happen today. Actually, last year, we were just talking with my friends, just last year, we've organized on April Fool's a trip to Transnistria, to which a lot of people have signed up. So obviously that was an absolute hoax, but if any one of you has signed up, it's my delight to present to you this, to familiarize yourself with the region, even if virtually. So today we're actually co-presenting with one more society, which is the EU History Society, many thanks to them as well, and with the Department of Russian and Slavonic Studies. So if I may just invite Connor Daly from the department to say a few words about the lecture series.
Thank you very much, Anna, and good evening. Welcome everybody to the fifth lecture in our series of 7 lectures, Understanding Europe's East. A core feature of this series has been the constant tension between nation states and empire, and the fragility of the nation state, that concept, buffeted as it is by competing phenomena, ethnicity, religious affiliation, or indeed resurgent revanchist empire building. And of the 7 regions that have been the subject of this series, only 2 are not represented as fully fledged nations at the UN. One was the subject of our second lecture, Kosovo, whose recognition, as we were told by Gizem Vysoka, is in a state of flux, recognition and derecognition, with 5 EU members still objecting, leaving aside any Security Council the veto the Russian Federation is likely to apply. But the focus of Keith Harrington's presentation tonight, Transnistria, is the second of those entities that does not have UN recognition, which I think is fair to say it is never likely to achieve. Transnistria, I think, in the popular imagination, something of a time warp, a focus of Soviet nostalgia, a locus of Russian nationalism. I was teaching a class an hour ago, and a student, when I mentioned this lecture, he produced from his pocket this banknote, 1 Transnistrian ruble, which the other members of the class quickly Googled and established the value was less than one euro cent. And but they also pointed out very observantly that the figure on the banknote is that of Alexander Suvorov, the 18th century undefeated generalissimo and friend and confidant of Russian Empress Catherine the Great. So Transnistria, however, is very important today in the geopolitics around Russia's attack on Ukraine. And that is why I look forward particularly to Keith's presentation tonight. I'd like to acknowledge support of the Trinity Faculty Events Fund and our cooperation with Anna Stinka and the DU Eastern Europe Society and DU History. And back to you, Anna, to introduce our speaker.
Perfect. Now, to introduce our speaker, thank you. So Dr. Keith Harrington is a historian of 20th century Europe with a particular focus on the Soviet Union and its successor states. He is currently associate professor in 20th century European history at TCD. His research focuses on minority nationalism and the various separatist conflicts that emerged during and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He is particularly interested in the role of local actors that play in mobilizing the communities and stoking unrest. It is my greatest pleasure to invite Dr. Harrington to commence the substantial part of today's lecture, please. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind words and excellent introduction. So what I am, is the PowerPoint on? There we go. Okay, so yeah, my lecture today is entitled Transnistria, Re-examining its Origins and Prospects for the Future. So how I've structured the talk is the first thing I'm going to provide is a brief overview of Transnistria because it is quite a unique entity in Europe. I mean, Transnistria probably envies Kosovo's status, to be honest, because nobody recognizes Transnistria and it's on nobody's official maps, not even Russia's. And I'll briefly just talk about my research and sort of the work I did during my PhD, and then I'll move on to talking about the formation of Transnistria, which will be the bulk of the talk. And I'll close by just discussing a little bit on Transnistria and how it's been impacted by Russia's most recent invasion of Ukraine. So in terms of Transnistria, to just cover some of the basics, well, as I said, if you look on a map of Europe, basically published anywhere outside of Transnistria, you won't see it on a map. But it's located in eastern Moldova, more or less along the border with Ukraine. So it's existed more or less since 1990 when it first declared its independence from Moldova. Now, the word Transnistria actually means beyond the Dniester in Romania, but as I'm going to talk about in a few slides, Transnistria has a very complicated relationship with Romania, so they prefer to use the name Pridnestrovia or the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic, but I use Transnistria because it's just more accepted in English. It has allegedly 469,000 people living there, but I mean, this is sort of subject to a lot of debate. And most interestingly, perhaps, its population is evenly divided, about 30% Russians, 30% Ukrainians, and 30% Moldovans, which is interesting when you consider that Moldova is perhaps their main enemy. But nevertheless, despite this sort of multi-ethnic factor, Russian is the main language of everyday life, regardless of your ethnic background. So Transnistria is a what we call a de facto state, and as Connor stated, it's not recognized by any UN member state, which creates a lot of practical difficulties for the people who live there and for the de facto government. So it's cut off from the rest of the world to a certain degree. It can't establish diplomatic relations or access international loans or aid in many cases. Nevertheless, Transnistria has many of the attributes of a recognized state. So it has a defined and stable borders. I mean, to a degree, they haven't changed since 1990. It has its own flag, currency, as we saw earlier, and is up here. I have plenty of it at home. It has a de facto president, parliament, a central bank who prints the currency, a police force, and even a 10,000 strong army. Additionally, the de facto government collects taxes, provides services, including education and healthcare and other services that you would associate with a normal state. Now, as Connor mentioned, if you think about Transnistria and if you Google it, you'll very quickly find that it's allegedly, the last outpost of the Soviet Union because they didn't remove any of their Soviet-era monuments. The reason for this is because it's such a multi-ethnic population that they still, on the surface, buy into this idea of building a Soviet people, that sort of is above ethnic differences. So every city, town, and village has a statue to Lenin and a monument to those who died during World War II and a whole load of others. Larger cities, you can still see pictures of people who've been awarded the title of Hero of Labor for working extra hard that month. And it's also the only country, if we can call it that has a hammer and a sickle on its flag, as we can see here. So it's often referred to as the last Soviet outpost, but this is somewhat misleading because in reality, Transnistria is an oligarch's paradise. Almost everything is owned by a man called Viktor Gushan, who is the name of his company is Sheriff because before becoming an oligarch, he was a corrupt police officer. So Sheriff operates basically everything: petrol stations, food stores, a TV channel, construction company, and most notably, they own a football team called FC Sheriff Tiraspol. They've won the Moldovan Premier League 21 times since 2000. They recently defeated Real Madrid 2-1, which was a huge deal. And I was once, they also played Dundalk maybe 2 or 3 years ago. But I was told that, this is how powerful this man is, that he doesn't pay taxes because the government is corrupt. So instead, he lets kids use the football fields behind the stadium for free. This is sort of the way he gives back. Additionally, there's deep oligarchical links running from Moldova and Ukraine. Many businessmen on both sides of the border, including allegedly former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko have made millions through various corruption schemes in Transnistria. So there's a deep network in trade going back and forward. So why does Transnistria matter? Well, Connor sort of touched on this, but to elaborate, Transnistria, it may be a small sliver of territory that a lot of people have never heard of, but it was the first post-Soviet pro-Russian separatist movement that was supported by Moscow to emerge. Since then, Moscow has supported pro-Russian separatist movements in Georgia, and which is South Ossetia and Abkhazia here, and they've created them in Donetsk and Luhansk. So Russia obviously uses, you could even argue this has become part of Russia's hybrid warfare strategy. They use these regions to maintain influence. Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, it makes it difficult for them to even aspire to join the EU or join NATO. Transnistria also has 1,000 Russian troops based in it, although I question their, desire to fight. It's been quite evident recently that they don't really want to do anything. They're just sort of there for a paycheck and a pension. Additionally, just on a side note, in northern Transnistria, there's a village called Kobasna, which is actually Europe's one of, if not the largest, ammunitions dump. Weapons can fall into the wrong hands. They've gone as far as Chechnya and the Middle East. And if it was ever to blow up, it's allegedly going to have the same impact as a small tactical nuclear weapon. So it's quite a strategic location for many reasons. But now, just a brief note on my own research. So surprisingly little has been written on the origins of Transnistria and the outbreak of the Transnistrian War. And most of the works that have been published were published between 93 and 2000. And these are mainly works done by political scientists and IR scholars, and they tend to rely mostly on sources available in Moldova's capital, which is Chisinau, such as national newspapers, records of Moldovan governmental meetings, or reports from NGOs or other bodies that were active trying to negotiate a ceasefire. So they typically focus on three main topics. The dispute as seen from the perspective of Chisinau and how they sort of try to negotiate with the leaders in Tiraspol. The violent phase of the conflict, which is from 91 to 92, where, of course, it really got a lot of attention in the national newspaper, or Russia's role in it. That was a very attractive topic and obviously still is. Just a brief note on local scholarship, it's often biased and endorses partisan narratives, and I recently contributed to a volume written by local scholars in English that sort of acknowledged this, that there's a need to maybe have more in-depth local discussions. So this was the topic of my PhD, and when I came to the topic, what I wanted to do was to write the most detailed account of the origins of the war, what caused it. So I aimed to look beyond Tiraspol, which you can kind of see this yellow part just above the screen there, and look at how the separatists gained popularity in provincial towns and rural regions, and really give a picture of what happened across all this region here, the 7 districts. I wanted to know, how did they co-opt and establish institutions before the war happened? How did they take power? And also to think, what extent did they enjoy popular support and whether anyone opposed them? And this is some of the stuff I'm going to elaborate on as we go forward. So to do this, I traveled to all 7 local archives in Transnistria, examined basically every government document I could get my hand on produced by village, district and city authorities. I looked at a very, very extensive range of local newspapers, about 70 in total. And I also did some work in Chisinau, where I looked at documents from the Central Committee, the Moldova's government, as well as some other newspapers to sort of get some context for what was going on. So without further ado, I'll jump into basically explaining the Transnistrian conflict. So I'm going to just jump through some of this part, but it's important to trace, because some of the narratives go back this far, back into the 1800s. So the Russian Empire in 1812 annexed a territory called Bessarabia, which today is most of modern day Romania. And during the period that it was under Tsarist control, Bessarabia was an economic backwater, often referred to as Western Siberia. Pushkin was exiled here for a short period of time until he had an affair with the governor's wife and then was sent back to actual Siberia, but he didn't like it. But of course, there is a monument to him in Chisinau today still. The Russian authorities acknowledged that the majority of the people who lived in this region, Bessarabia, were Romanians. So they had this idea that they were ethnic Romanians. But nevertheless, in 1848, when revolution spread across many parts of Central and Eastern Europe, Romania included, links between Bessarabia and Romania were severed. So as a result, the Romanians of Bessarabia never really developed a sense of national identity, like a Romanian national identity. When Romania began to sort of Latinize its language, etc., none of these reforms were brought into Bessarabia. And this is important because the Soviets would exploit this from 1924 all the way up to 89. So after a brief period of independence after the collapse of the Russian Empire, Bessarabia was forced to unite with Romania in 1918. But the Romanians acted more like colonizers than liberators, so they didn't really win a lot of favor with the local population, regardless of ethnicity. The Soviets never accepted the loss of Bessarabia, despite the fact that they were supposedly so different to the Tsarist Empire. And they moved to exploit the local differences that I just talked about, the fact that there wasn't a strong sense of Romanian identity. So Soviet officials argued that the people who lived in Bessarabia were actually their own ethnic group, known as Moldovans. And they were being discriminated against by Romanians. In 1924, they created what you can see on the map here, the Moldavian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in modern-day Transnistria. And scholars here basically worked to prove that the inhabitants of Bessarabia weren't Romanians and that they were suffering. It was the first state for the Moldovan people, allegedly. So in 1940, the Soviets annexed Bessarabia from Romania with the agreements of Adolf Hitler as a result of the Non-Aggression Pact. They conjoined Transnistria with Central Bessarabia to create the Moldavian SSR, and gave Moldova the borders it has today. The Soviets argued that Moldova was a state for the Moldovan people. And pro-Romanian nationalists, those who said, well, maybe we're ethnic Romanians and not Moldovans, they were brutally suppressed, although most of them left. They were given 2 days to evacuate before the Soviets came in. Romania briefly reoccupied the region from 1941 to 44. But Bessarabia was reintegrated into Romania, while Transnistria was treated as an occupied region where many death camps were established. So there was two very different experiences of Romanian occupation for the two peoples, which will become important later. So when the Soviets came back, basically any expression of Romanian nationalism was considered synonymous with fascism. You could be deported, imprisoned, etc., etc. So there was a heavy propaganda campaign to draw parallels between the two. Now, up until, say, from 1944 until 89, Transnistria and Moldova had two very different experiences of Soviet rule. So Transnistria received preferential treatment from Moscow for the simple reason they'd been part of the Soviet Union since 1924. So despite accounting for less than 10% of Moldova's territory, Transnistria contained 40% of its industry. Most of these enterprises were subordinated to Moscow, not Chisinau. So this was very important because you could live your whole life in Tiraspol and never have to interact with the government in the capital of Moldova. The rest of Moldova, apart from a few select cities, was basically dependent on agriculture, collective farms, winemaking, and tobacco. Most of Moldova's leaders came from Transnistria, Ukraine, or Russia. So those who led the republic were always from these regions. Again, Moldovans from Moldova proper were viewed with suspicion because of their connections, or at least their experience of living under bourgeois Romanian rule. Russian became the language of social, political, and economic life, and this was particularly true in Transnistria, where some places didn't even have Moldovan language schools. So this was very much a situation. Now, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, had a great idea that he was going to reform it. So he launched a series of reforms aimed at revitalizing economic, political, social life, encouraging debate, etc., etc. So the Moldova's government was a conservative, and they resisted implementing any meaningful reforms because they knew the challenges that it would bring. You weren't allowed to acknowledge a relationship with Romania, and you weren't allowed to talk about that it used to be part of Romania. So it was going to bring a lot of issues. Nevertheless, in 1988, activists and intellectuals began organizing grassroots movements in Moldova's capital, Chisinau, that sort of argued for greater reform. Now, they mobilized people to the street by calling for language reforms, which would make Moldovan the sole official language of the Republic and recognize its unity with Romanian. And this appealed to many Moldovans who'd moved into the bigger cities and realized that they needed to learn Russian to get forward, but Russians or other minorities didn't need to learn their language. So the government reacted harshly against these groups. They made them illegal. They cancelled their protests. They criticized them in the press. So in response, many of these groups united to form the Popular Front of Moldova in 1989. So the Popular Front's leaders were sort of prominent intellectuals, and they had access to the press, and they used the press to bombard articles about to bombard the press with articles about the language laws and organize mass rallies. And this is one here in support of the language laws on the 27th of August 1989, and anywhere from 300,000 to 500,000 people turned up. And Moldova has a population at that time of like 3.5 million, so it's a significant amount. So calls to make the Moldovan the sole official language appealed to members of a governmental body called the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. So this was essentially a body that was empowered in the Soviet system to draft laws. Now, beforehand, their laws were their position was meaningless because they had to sign off on what the government told them to do. So any aspiring Moldovans were just put here. But Gorbachev sort of gave them real power to draft laws on their own, and suddenly this was a problem. So throughout the course of 1989, they drafted laws to make Moldovan the sole official language. On the 28th of August, the Supreme Soviet or the Parliament convened. They debated, and on the 31st of August 1989, Moldovan was made the sole official language of Moldova. Now, what's important to note is that these laws were quite fair. What was published on the 31st of August? Moldovan was the sole official language, but Russian was the language of interethnic communication. You could still use Russian to communicate with the state. The problem was the laws were very ambiguous. What an official language meant wasn't very clear. For example, in the Baltics, the official language, which I believe you covered 2 weeks ago, meant that some people, if they didn't speak Estonian, could lose their citizenship, lose their jobs, etc. So because of the ambiguous nature of the laws, they alarmed Moldova's Russian-speaking population, who accounted for about 35% or 40% of the whole Republic's population. So across the Republic, people protested the laws, but the protests were particularly pronounced in Transnistria. So in Tiraspol, a group called the United Work Collective Council, or known by its Russian acronym OSTK, was formed on the 11th of August 1989. So the OSTK was led by directors of the city's largest enterprise. Tiraspol was probably the most industrialized city in all of Moldova. Soon, branches of the OSTK were opened in Transnistria's other large industrial cities. Remember, 40% of the enterprises are in this region. So the OSTK basically said that if Russian is not made the second official language, we will strike, because they feared they would lose their position. These guys here, they only dealt with Moscow. Most of them, I mean, Smirnov only arrived in 1985. He's the first president of the OSTK. So most of them had no attachment to Moldova. So from the 21st of August to the 23rd of September 1989, there were strikes against the language laws. At their peak, about 100,000 workers partook. So the strikes happened all across Moldova. It wasn't just an incident that was isolated to Transnistria, but about 2/3 came from the city of Tiraspol and another Transnistrian city called Ribnica. Now, in Transnistria, the local authorities responded very poorly to the strike. So they didn't engage in the workers. When I looked at newspapers from other Russian-speaking cities in other parts of Moldova, they came out and they talked to the workers, they explained the laws, but this didn't happen in Transnistria, which naturally created a power vacuum. During the strikes, the OSTK, who were leading the strikes, they held mass rallies and published their own newsletters, which exaggerated the impacts of the laws. They had lots and lots of information from the Baltics saying this is going to be the same, you're going to lose your citizenship, you won't be able to vote, etc. So by the end of the strikes, the OSTK was the most popular group in Transnistria. Now, it was during the strikes that the idea of an autonomous Transnistria was born. Beforehand, you can't even find any reference really to the name Transnistria apart from a few references in the Second World War. So in their newsletters, the OSTK argued that if they declared an autonomous region in Transnistria, well, they could circumvent the law and adopt their own laws and make Russian the second official language. So in order to end the strikes, the local governments in Transnistria promised the OSTK to form commissions to investigate whether autonomy would be feasible and legal. On the 3rd of December 1989, the OSTK in the city of Ribnica, which I've mentioned a few times, organized a referendum on autonomy without the support of the local authorities. The OSTK in Tiraspol then used this to pressure the local authorities there to organize a referendum in January. In both cases, allegedly, everyone voted for autonomy. And this is the picture of the referendums in Tiraspol. As part of his reforms, Gorbachev scheduled local and republic elections for the spring of 1990. So these elections were, well, nominally free. I mean, you couldn't have no political parties could participate, but independent candidates could run for the first time. The elections polarized Moldovan society. The Popular Front and its sympathizers controlled about 2/3 of Moldova's parliament. But in Transnistria, as we can see in this graph, which I'm going to have to explain in a second, the OSTK won a landslide. So the blue just shows the number of deputies elected to a particular region, and the orange is the number of newcomers. And basically, in all cases, newcomers were OSTK deputies. So you can see that they took a considerable portion of the seats. So this changed the local dynamics considerably, because beforehand, the OSTK was outside the realms of power. So the newly elected Supreme Soviet moved quickly. The Popular Front and its sympathizers adopted a new state flag, a tricolor which closely resembled Romania's. Russian-speaking deputies claimed that the flag's adoption violated the constitution, but when they tried to leave the parliament after debate, they were actually physically assaulted by Popular Front supporters, so they withdrew from the parliament and didn't come back. This was probably one of the last time Transnistrian deputies were there. In Transnistria's largest cities, the new flag was labeled a fascist symbol and outlawed, because the only time the Romanian tricolour had been flown in Transnistria was during the period of occupation from 41 to 44. They said it's not our symbol. Additionally, because it was late April, it wasn't long before Victory Day was being celebrated in the Soviet Union. So they used this, speakers in Transnistria used this as an opportunity to say, why are we honouring our veterans under the flag of the country that they fought against? The local authorities in Transnistria then moved quickly after withdrawing from the state institutions. In Transnistria's industrial cities, they used the tricolour as an excuse to create private militias. They said this is proof that fascists have taken over Chisinau. These militias were supposed to protect the region's population, and they were funded exclusively by local enterprises, not by the government. In June 1990, an extraordinary congress was called in Transnistria that gathered around 600 political representatives from the region. So delegates stopped short of declaring independence or autonomy, but created a free economic zone. The region, this free economic zone, was to be governed by a so-called coordination committee, which conveniently had the power to veto any Moldovan law passed after the 31st of August 1989. Essentially, they could veto the language laws and the new tricolour. So in June 1990, Moldova's parliament issued a declaration of sovereignty. It wasn't quite independence, but it was a clear signal. And they also proclaimed that the annexation of Bessarabia, which happened in 1940, was illegal. Now, it was this annexation of Bessarabia that brought Transnistria and Moldova together. So the Transnistrians argued, well, if the annexation was illegal, then we're no longer obliged to obey your orders because we were illegally attached to you. Obviously, the Moldovan government didn't agree. But on the 2nd of September 1990, another congress was organized in Tiraspol. Here, delegates declared the creation of the Transnistrian Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. The new republic was independent of Moldova, but still firmly within the Soviet Union. This was the desire to remain there, not to be fully independent. Moldova's government naturally annulled the declaration the next day. Just to take a quick note, as I said, 30% of Transnistria's population today are ethnic Moldovans, and back then it was 40%. And when I came to research Transnistria, I thought, well, how did these people respond to what was happening? Now, many scholars believe that Transnistria's Moldovan population were Russian speakers, so they sort of supported it. And in some ways, this is true for those who lived in the cities. But about 72% of Transnistria's Moldovan population lived in rural regions. And here they had a very strong sense of ethnic identity. They weren't as heavily Russified. And I found that from looking at newspapers that they supported the language laws, the tricolour, and they opposed secession as well. And this is just a protest of 3,000 Transnistrian Moldovans gathering to just a few days after Transnistria declared independence. Even a parallel government that recognized Moldova's sovereignty over Transnistria was formed at this rally, but I never found any more information. I don't know really what happened to it. It's just a brief mention in a few newspaper articles. So in 1990, tens of thousands of Popular Front supporters marched south. In the south of Moldova, they were also struggling with a separatist movement called the Gagus. I won't talk much about them, but what you need to know is they were organizing their own parliamentary elections. And the people marched, about 30,000 people marched out to prevent it. So violence was narrowly avoided when Soviet troops intervened and turned the Moldovans back. But the event alarmed the Transnistrians, who were organizing their own elections in November. So they very quickly said, okay, we need to exert control over our regions. These areas that are still loyal to Moldova, we need to have control of them. So the region that was a hotbed for pro-Moldovan sentiment was the Dimitar district, which is in the center of Transnistria. So here, Transnistrian paramilitaries surrounded their administrative buildings and their courthouses, and they demanded that they recognize Transnistria's sovereignty. They refused and managed to telephone Moldova to try and get help. Moldovan police officers attempted to cross the bridge that connects Dimitar to the rest of Moldova. But it's not really clear what happened. Obviously, both sides blame each other. But what we know happened was a shootout ensued and 3 Transnistrians were killed. And this was important because Transnistria had its first martyrs. And this is a picture of a grieving mother mourning her son that was circulated in every Transnistrian newspaper and used to rally support and proof that Moldovans were allegedly the aggressors. In early 1991, several pro-separatist figures were arrested by the Moldovan police. This included in the summer of 1991, Igor Smirnov, who's photographed here. So in response, Transnistria imposed an economic blockade on Moldova. Remember, they control 40% of the enterprises, many of which generate electricity. Moldova declared independence from the Soviet Union on the 27th of August, 1991, and Transnistria followed suit on the 2nd of September. Now, all the while that this was going on, they were under an economic blockade, but eventually they had to relent and release all the separatist leaders that they had arrested. So this actually did nothing but bolster the separatists' prestige at home. When Smirnov returned to Transnistria, he was considered a hero, as photographed here. He's greeting members of the Women's Strike Committee. They were the ones who it was the Women's Strike Committee that really led the economic blockade. And I have perhaps some nice photos I could have shared where they're sitting on railway tracks blocking trains. So in December 1991, he was elected president of Transnistria. Just a brief detour. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this, but in terms of the role of Russia, it's quite complicated. So Moldovan press and politicians were quick to blame Gorbachev for supporting the separatists, but it wasn't necessarily that clear. In general, Gorbachev, at least in public, supported Moldova. So he supported the language laws the Transnistrians opposed. Representatives from Moscow told the Transnistrians they weren't entitled to autonomy, it was illegal. And he also annulled the declaration of the Transnistrian Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. The separatists did indeed receive significant support from the Soviet armed forces who were stationed in the region. So one of the commanders in 1991 actually became the head of Transnistria's Ministry of Defense, but he was quickly dismissed from Moscow. But as the Soviet Union began to fall apart, many units that were stationed in Transnistria began to defect to the separatists because Moldova was calling for these people to, go back to Russia, etc., etc. But a lot of the Russian units there, they had lived in Transnistria for 10, 15 years, and Russia wasn't really their home anymore. And so they felt a sense of security and stability. In the spring of 1992, the Russian Air Force began flying Cossacks, which we can see photographed here, into Transnistria. And then in April 1992, Alexander Lebed, photographed here in the back with the hat, who was a vocal supporter of the separatists, was appointed commander of the Russian troops. So what I'm trying to point out is the Russian Federation were more supporters than the Soviet Union. So emboldened by Lebed's support, the separatists attacked several pro-Moldovan villages in the Dubasar district on the 2nd of March 1992. And thousands of refugees began streaming across the Dniester, the river that divides Transnistria from the rest of Moldova. Moldovan police and volunteers, who some of which are photographed here, mobilized to engage the separatists, and fighting happened in this region for several months. In April 1992, then, fighting broke out in the city of Bender, which was another industrial city claimed by Transnistria. In June 1992, separatist forces surrounded the police station and basically unloaded thousands of rounds of ammunition. The police officers were still loyal to Moldova. The government responded quickly, sending troops to the city. And the separatists were actually ejected, and this looked like a decisive victory. That was until the next day when Lebed's forces mobilized and attacked the Moldovans and quickly pushed them out of the city. So this is when Russia decisively intervenes on the side of the Transnistrians. So throughout 1992, there were multiple attempts to end the conflict. Russia, Ukraine, and Moldova had engaged in peace talks, ceasefire talks, but they kept falling apart, which actually led to Ukraine and Romania losing interest very quickly, and they kind of just wanted to back away, which obviously left Moldova at the mercy of Russia. Moldova attempted to negotiate directly with the Transnistrians, and in 1992, they offered them to create a special economic zone, which, if that sounds familiar, well, that's what the Transnistrians declared in 1990. However, they said that the capital of this region would be Dubasar, and this was not only an insult to the separatists, but it was too little too late. At this point, they were emboldened by Russian support and said they'd settle for nothing less than a federal Moldova, sort of a loosely connected state. So Lebed's intervention alarmed Moldovans, and on the 21st of July 1992, Yeltsin flew out, Mircea Snegur, the Moldovan president, flew out and met Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president, and they signed a ceasefire. The ceasefire was signed directly between Russia and Moldova, not Transnistria. Just a little brief overview of maybe this should be Transnistria since 1992. So the Yeltsin-Snegur agreement ended the fighting, but it didn't provide any mechanisms or guidelines for Transnistria's reintegration into Moldova. It also created a tripartite peacekeeping force, which in some ways legitimized Russia's military presence in the region. Moscow maintains it won't withdraw its 1,000 or so troops until a peaceful settlement is reached. Obviously, though, they also consistently undermine any settlements. As a result, Transnistria has been free to cultivate its de facto independence under Russian protection. Since 1992, Transnistria has continued to support, Russia has continued to support Transnistria, and Moscow has used the region to maintain influence over Moldova. This was most clearly seen in 2003 when Putin attempted to negotiate a unilateral settlement that would create a federal Moldova, but it was undermined at the last minute. I will wrap up now in a second. So the downturn in Russian-Ukrainian relations following the Maidan revolution has placed Transnistria in a very difficult position. Russia may be Transnistria's benefactor, but the region has deep social, economic, and cultural ties to Ukraine. 1/3 of Transnistrians hold Ukrainian citizenship, and Ukrainian is one of the official languages. Additionally, Transnistria exports far more to Ukraine, well, it did before the war, than it did to Russia. So just for example, in 2014, Transnistria's de facto president, Vadim Krasnoselsky, refused to say who Crimea rightfully belonged to. This was in contrast to Moldovan president at the time, Igor Dodon, who was very public in saying that, well, Crimea belongs to Russia, and actually was banned from visiting Ukraine. Additionally, Transnistria has refrained from establishing relations with the Donetsk or Luhansk People's Republics. Yes, Transnistrians have been out there and helped set up some of the security services, but these are ones that don't get along with Krasnoselsky and his regime. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Transnistria sought to maintain its so-called neutral position. So tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees have arrived in Transnistria, most of whom stayed with family and friends, which sort of shows the deep connections that run on either side of the border. Transnistria media, interestingly enough, rather than calling it a war or a special military operation, they've used the term situation in Ukraine to sort of try and maintain their neutrality. Pro-war rallies were not endorsed by the de facto authorities, and relatively few have participated. And finally, just to talk about what's happening on this very moment. Since Russia's invasion, the separate authorities have found themselves in a super difficult position. The border with Ukraine is fully closed. Transnistria now relies on Moldova for all of its imports and exports. On the flip side, I think we've maybe all noticed this, Moldova has received a lot more support from the EU, the US, and the West in general. Just for example, although this isn't necessarily connected to the EU and the US, but in 2023, the Council of Europe labeled Transnistria a Russian-occupied region. Recently, the de facto authorities appealed to Russia for help, which is something that I've been asked to comment a lot about in the media over the last couple of weeks. But in reality, I don't think this means anything, because as long as Russian forces are stuck in eastern Ukraine, this is only a symbolic gesture from a desperate regime that feels like it's on borrowed time more than anything else. In terms of what does the future hold, well, as a historian, I'm not really qualified to say that in particular. But on a side note, I'm hoping to turn my PhD into a monograph, which I've entitled Russia's First Victim, Moldova, Moscow, and the Origins of the Transnistrian War. And all the sources, the thousands of newspaper articles, I'm hoping will be published online one day to act as sort of a resource for scholars, students, etc. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you got something out of it.
No, thank you very much. We will just open the floor for a few questions, and Ksenia will just hand you the microphone once you're ready. So please just raise your hands and we will hand you the mic. Yep.
So thank you very much. This is an extraordinary story of this area. How did you come to take an interest in Transnistria?
Thanks. Is this on? Oh, okay. Is it on?
No.
No. I mean, I can just step back up there. Yep. Is it on? We good? Okay. Apparently, I gotta hold it up to my mouth. So sorry. In terms of how did I find out about Transnistria, or how did I, discover my love for it? In 2014, with the invasion of Crimea, with the annexation of Crimea, I saw an interview with the Moldovan prime minister at the time, who was talking about, he said, oh, Russia came here and did the same 20 years ago. But because I was like, what was I, 17, 18 at the time, I didn't catch that it was Moldova. So it was always in the back of my mind, and it was always an interest. And then years later, when I was working at an awful part-time job, and I was scrolling through Wikipedia, I actually found Transnistria on Wikipedia, and it reignited my interest. So from there, I wrote my BA dissertation on it, and then Maynooth asked me to stay on to do a PhD on it, and it's basically been a real interest ever since. So that's how I found it.
Thank you very much, Keith, for a really interesting talk. To what extent are Russian speakers in the rest of Moldova, in Chisinau and elsewhere, supportive of Transnistria? Do Moldovans feel, or rather do Ukrainians in Odessa feel that they could be attacked from there, or is it just there are too few Russian troops and it's militarily impossible? And finally, how is all this going to affect Moldovans' application to join the European Union?
In terms of how have Russian speakers in Moldova responded, it's kind of interesting, because one thing someone had said to me was actually, in some ways, Russia's war in Ukraine was great for Moldova, because the first wave of refugees that arrived in Ukraine were from the Odessa region, and most of them were Russian speakers. So Russian speakers in Moldova realized that Putin's bullets and bombs don't discriminate, so this is something. But the group that I mentioned there, the Gagus in the south of Moldova, they're a Turkic ethnic group, but basically they all speak Russian. And they have been even more supportive of the war than the Transnistrians have. So they have been very, they're sort of the exception. Now, there is still a sort of pro-Russian populist movement, but it has been damaged by the war for sure. And in terms of Moldova joining Ukraine, when I look at for Macedonia and Albania, Moldova joined the EU. I don't necessarily hold my breath for Moldova getting in. I mean, they're further down. But the EU has said, we will accept you without Transnistria. And of course, they have done this with Cyprus before, so there is somewhat of a pretext. But I wouldn't be holding my breath for them to get in. I think it's, regardless of what's said, I think it's mostly symbolic, as long as poor Albania and Macedonia are waiting around.
Hi, Professor, thank you very much for your lecture there. Just a quick question. So it was very interesting to hear that you actually visited Transnistria and all of its regions. I just wanted a note from you, maybe just how language has evolved there. So I didn't realize that Ukrainian was actually an official language of Transnistria, but maybe obviously it shares the border with Moldova. I'd just like to know, if there's a kind of a language makeup there. Is there people that speak even Romanian, close to Moldova? I'd just like to know from you there.
So in terms of the language makeup, as I said, Russian is the dominant language. If you go anywhere, you need to speak Russian. I heard Ukrainian only spoken in the north, where maybe actually up to 60% of the population in these regions are Ukrainian. And then in terms of, it's complicated. They still call it Moldovan. They still have the Soviet era idea. And there are Moldovan schools, and I've heard Moldovan spoken. There are also Romanian language schools, but this has become a big controversy because anytime there's a dispute between Moldova and Transnistria, they shut down the 7 or so Romanian language schools, they defund them, they harass students, parents, etc., etc. So it's quite a complicated situation. But on the flip side, when I interviewed somebody from the OSTK, they were like, we even have Romanian language schools, we're so great, thinking that obviously I had never read anything about the region. They claim to be and one thing they're very proud of in terms of schools is that they have Ukrainian language schools for Ukrainian refugees to study in, but there are, but it's 90% Russian language schools regardless of ethnicity.
Hi, thank you for this. My question is just about the security framework going forward into the future. Like, is this going to be another Ukraine? Or is this going to be, I know the conflict has to end at one point in time, it might be in the next 20 years or in the next 10 years, but it is going to be another Ukraine. And do you think, the West or the EU is going to, take or try to collaborate with the Russians or any security framework for a particular region? Because I'm just thinking from my own point of view and from what I've just seen here, that if that is not happening, there might be another Ukraine or another regional conflicts again. So what do you think about that?
I think that I don't think there's going to be cooperation between Russia and the EU for the simple fact that there has been dialogue with Russia involved since 1992 and it's gone nowhere. So I don't think dialogue with Russia going forward is going to work. I think people have realized that. But in terms of whether this could be another war, that's obviously, I'm not sure. I know there's 10,000. For example, the Transnistrian army is better armed than a Moldovan army. So Transnistria has enough troops to defend itself, but not really to do much more. But I think that, and this is, I think, the thinking of a lot of my colleagues, that Transnistria is the easiest dispute to resolve because it's not so much ethnic based. If you look at Abkhazia and Nagorno-Karabakh, there's all these ethnic cleansings. This didn't really happen. So I would be surprised if it became a flashpoint. Both Transnistria and Moldova have done a good job since the war of maybe not maintaining dialogue, but not to have sort of aggressive statements. I mean, Zelensky has said, we'll invade Transnistria, and President Sandu in Moldova has come out and said, we don't want to do that. So I think there's a positive dialogue. I'd be surprised if war broke out in the next 10 or 20 years. I think if there's going to be another conflict in the post-Soviet space, it will be Georgia, Abkhazia, or South Ossetia, which it's a lot more toxic there. This is a more political dispute with money in the right pockets. I mean, the main thing is what happens to Sheriff. I mean, that's the biggest question. Does he take over every business in Moldova? Do other grocery stores move in there? I mean, these are the real questions that they're concerned about. War is not good for him. So
Can I ask a quick question there, Keith, about the army? You mentioned an army of 10,000, of which 1,000 are Russians. So I'm curious about how the Russian soldiers are equipped and provisioned and supplied given the war in Ukraine, and how physically does Shoigu, Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, keep in touch with his troops in Transnistria? Or are they his troops in any sense?
well, this is an interesting question because, well, first of all, the 10,000 troops that they have there, just to say a quick word on them, a lot of them are just conscripts. If you don't go to university in Transnistria, you're conscripted. So I've met a lot of these troops and I've talked to them and they don't really want to be there. So that sort of covers them. And the Russian troops there, when you arrive to Transnistria, you go through a Moldovan police checkpoint. They never check you on the way in, but they always check you on the way out. And then there's in no man's land where there's Russians. And they're very well armed. There's always an armored personnel carrier and a fair amount of troops. And you'll see quite well armed troops throughout the region at various checkpoints. But on the flip side, Transnistrians' citizenship isn't recognized anywhere. So Transnistrians have Russian citizenship, they have Ukrainian citizenship, they have Moldovan, Romanian, sometimes they have them all together. So a lot of these Russian troops are actually Transnistrians who were born there, who just got a Russian passport, who want a stable job. So, I mean, there doesn't seem to be much intervention from the Russian Ministry of Defense. There doesn't seem to be any directives coming there. And in terms of these 1,000, any idea that they'll get involved in the Ukraine war is absurd. I mean, there's 1,000 of them, so they're, it might take a few villages in Ukraine and then have to retreat. So I think they're mostly Transnistrians who want a pension when they retire, and it's the best way to get it.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone's interested. Okay, so we will end it here. I thank you very much again, Dr. Harrington, for this lecture. It's really interesting and really heartwarming to know that the research is done in Trinity on my country. Transnistria is not my country. Moldova is my country. Hold on. Yeah, also thank you very much to the audience today. I've just checked the list. I've noticed that most people here are not Moldovan or Romanian, so it's really good to know that most of the people interested here are from Ireland. And I will use this moment to invite you to the next lecture, this time next week, the same place, and it's going to be about a country that actually exists, Moldova. So please, you're very welcome. The talk will be mainly on the policy of citizenship and the Jews' position in it. So please come in, and thank you very much again for today. Thank you very much.